I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but did you know I'm from Iowa, small town? You've heard that before. All right, I'm going to tell you a story. I promise this has something to do with the state of the church address. And if this is not unique to Iowa. I think if you've ever grew up in a small town, this will resonate with you. In my hometown, we did not use addresses. And what I mean by that is everybody had an address, but if you gave directions, I would never say to someone, 816 South 3rd Street. That was my address, but that's not how you would get to my house. I would say you would go to the courthouse. You know, you can't miss the courthouse. It's the only 3-story building in town. Go to the courthouse, turn right, big gray house on your right. If you get to the county shop, you've gone too far. All right, that's how you used landmarks to get people where they needed to go. There were landmarks. My town was a mile by a mile. There were 5 different landmarks. I won't take you through all, but on the west side of town, there was the big red barn. That's where everybody, you know, eventually the town had grown out to the big red barn, and so that was where you always gave. If you wanted to go on Meadowlark Lane, you would give directions based on the big red barn. 2 things happened in the 1980s in my small town. First, the big red barn got torn down. Second, nobody noticed. Why this was significant, this is a true story, embellished perhaps, but true story. I was coming out of Mandy's. No, excuse me, not Mandy's, Sandy's. You see how that works? Sandy's was the coffee shop, deli, paint and supply store. So if you needed a sandwich or you needed to paint your house, you went to Sandy's, all right? I was coming out and there was a gentleman there who was asking for directions. He was probably in his early 20s. I remember he was driving like a Trans Am, a cool looking car. And he was asking this old farmer for directions. And I remember watching it, and I think this stuck with me because 2, I liked his car, and 2, I don't think I'd ever seen anybody really lost in the town of Montezuma before. But they wanted directions to somewhere out, probably on Meadowlark Lane. And what did the old farmer say to give him directions? Drive west. When you get to where the big red barn used to be, take a left. It'll be the 4th house down. And the poor guy just looked at him, kind of waiting for the punchline, realized it wasn't coming. He simply said, thank you, got in his car and started driving west. And for all we know, he went to California, right? Those are not good. Now, here's the point of that. Landmarks are really, really helpful for giving us directions. But the reality is, the landmarks that churches have used for the last 50 or 60 years are either torn down or they are in disrepair. And here's what I mean by that. I actually brought notes with me today, but we've had 2 kind of landmarks as a church. This is my entire life, frankly, for most of your lives, I'm guessing. To judge, to evaluate, to determine how well a congregation was doing, we had 2 statistics we could always go to. What were those 2 statistics? Church attendance and budget. Or what pastors will sometimes call, have you heard this? Butts and bucks. All right? How many bucks are coming in? How many backsides do you have in the pews? That's how churches determine. Now those were not perfect. That's not a perfect way to evaluate your congregation's faithfulness, right? However, those numbers did tell us something. If people are consistently giving to your church, that tells you people are engaged. If people are showing up on a regular basis, that tells you, oh, your church is growing, or oh, your church is declining. Those told us some important numbers. There was 2 other numbers that told us some things. Anyone want to guess what those 2 other landmarks would have been?
Births and deaths.
Yes, births, deaths. What's interesting is deaths were never something the church was. The church has always tracked deaths, and I think the Lutheran Church has always done a good job in general caring for people who've died. But on the parochial reports, the numbers that got paid more attention to was births, baptisms, and confirmation. Because the assumption behind that is, you know what? Regardless of what's happening with your church attendance, as long as you have more and more baptisms, as long as you are confirming these kids, eventually what does that mean for your church? Well, that's your farm system, right? Those are the kids that are coming up. That's the direction you're going. That puts you on a trajectory. Well, the problem is all of those landmarks are struggling today. And I'm going to walk you through kind of why that is. Regular worship attendance used to be considered 3 out of 4 Sundays. Does that make sense? So if you told someone, yeah, I go to church at United Lutheran, the assumption was you went to church 3 out of 4 Sundays. And some of you are, actually this group would probably say, yeah, that sounds about right. Do you know what regular worship attendance is considered now? It's 1 time a month. Okay. Now that's normal. Congregations used to, when it comes to money, used to receive a lion's share of a person's giving. Now, there are a host of really good charities and causes who in many cases have done a really good job of telling people why supporting them is important. As a result, congregations are living in a different environment than we used to 20, 30, 40 years ago. Finally, when it comes to baptism, I never want to underestimate the importance of baptism, but we have to acknowledge that the societal pressure that used to exist is no longer as strong as it once was. What I mean by this is if you had a child 50 years ago and you weren't super committed to your church, but if you had a child 50 years ago, were you going to have that child baptized? Absolutely. And if you had any question about that, ask your grandmother. Your child was going to be baptized 50 years ago, right? Grandmother said it was going to happen. And if you would like to be there as parents, great. But otherwise, grandma was going to take that child and get that child baptized. That type of pressure is not there any longer. And as a result, it's a different environment. And frankly, the last one is about kids. We should probably acknowledge that kids who are baptized, generally speaking, are not as present in the church as they were generations ago, which means if the average person comes to church once a month, this means we get 12 times a year to help plant, shape, and grow their faith. The chance of a little one being baptized actually being shaped by the church is substantially less than it was a generation ago. Now, I promise we're going to get to some good news here in a minute, but because everything's not doom and gloom, but these are the challenges church are facing. So these have ramifications. I'm sure this group knows that mainline Protestant churches have been declining for kind of since the 80s, right? Does everybody know that? Like church attendance. For instance, the ELCA has decreased in members every year of our existence. What has happened now is because of COVID, we've had this downward trend. Because of COVID, if you look around the country, we don't know what the statistics are yet, but our bishop said at the last fall theological gathering that when she talks to bishops around the country, they're reporting anywhere from a 40 to a 60% decline in worship attendance. So what it means is we've been kind of going like this for 40 years, and during COVID, it is like off a cliff. Now that may return when COVID is over. At the same time, I think we should acknowledge that when people change habits, people who are marginally connected to churches change their habits, the chances of them suddenly reconnecting, there's going to be some challenges there. So I tell you all this to say that's our context, all right? Are you depressed enough yet? Okay. Now here's the good news. God is still God. The God who parted the Red Sea and raises the dead looks at our context, and it may make us nervous, and God says, I got this, all right? But it does mean the landmarks we're going to use are going to have to be different. The second aspect I wanted to talk about before we get going too closely is closely related to the first. In addition to people's changing habits, We should acknowledge that we live in a post-Christian world. This means that church, faith, Christianity, however you want to talk about it, is just one of many, many things a person can participate in. It's one of the many identities a person can claim. Now, this has always been the case in my lifetime, but I think it's even more so. And I'll give you an example of how this played out in our church. And I don't say this in a disparaging way. This is just, I want you to understand this is the world we live in. We had confirmation here, 2 months ago at the church. We broke at the time we broke the groups up into, we confirmed 2 different worship services so that everybody could bring as many family members and friends as they wanted. This sounds really old-fashioned, but the reason what we ended up doing is we had boys and girls separate. And the reason we did this was for no other reason than we were going to have half the kids at one service, half the other, and the small group said, well, we want to get confirmed as a group. Well, that makes sense. The boys had all been together. There was a couple girls groups, so that was fine. So what ended up happening is our boys' confirmation, the night they got together and they shared their faith stories or their faith projects, they were exactly what you would expect of 15-year-old boys talking about their faith. For those of you who got confirmed in this church, I don't care what year it was, you were exactly like these boys. Because 15-year-old boys have not changed since the dawn of time, all right? They look like little men, and inside there's just all sorts of little stuff that it's just not firing yet, right? And so when they talked about their faith, I love these boys. This is one of those groups of young men, I should say this again. They're going to turn out to be really good men someday. But along the way, they're going to give their parents lots of gray hairs, okay? That's this group of boys as a whole. I like these kids very much, but when they talk about their faith, they have sincerity, but they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the depth to reflect, they don't have, it is often, God loves me, God helped me with the big game the other night. That was like, that's kind of where God's at in their life, and guess what? That's been true since the beginning of time, okay? But then the girls at that age, at the age of 15, they're not, people say, well, girls are like 2 or 3 years beyond boys at that age. No, girls are a different species than boys at that age, right? I've had this, I've often marveled at even siblings who are the same age, like they'll be in very different places, how they articulate their faith, how they think about their faith. But this group of young women, very, very smart, very reflective, took this very seriously. This is the part I'm going to say to you that's going to probably make some of you nervous. It shouldn't. When most of these young women talked and told their faith story, to use the word as identify is something that the kids would, that's a word that they use. I identify as this. Most of those girls would not identify themselves as Christians. They're not anti-faith. They have questions about the faith, but they are not, the boys would say, yeah, absolutely, I'm a Christian. I mean, because God's going to help me win the big game, okay? So that's where they're at. These girls who have given serious thought to their faith say, I don't know. Maybe. That's different. And those are kids who come from church families, in the most part, who have been at least shaped and formed, at least in part, by our congregation. That is where they are at. So that tells you about the wider world of our younger people, that there's just this sense of Christianity, there's not as much engagement as we would like. Now, before we go forward to talk about what this is going to mean, do you have any, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. Any questions or any observations? Any other? Because here's what I want to do. I want to give you 5 different landmarks. That's the whole point of this, all right? The whole preamble was to say, maybe there are some different landmarks as a congregation we could be using. And here's I want to give you 5. Worship participation is still critical. Okay, it's still critical, but it looks different now. Whether people are gathering in person or choosing to participate online, Christians still need to prioritize worship. All right, I don't want to give up on the importance of worship. How do you track worship attendance though? I don't know how we do that. I mean, I know how the ELCA does it. I know how we're supposed to do it. We still keep track of how many people show up at worship on Sunday mornings. And I know that we are supposed to, you don't need to probably get into this too much, but how we host our online worship service, however many people watch, if there's 300 views, we should multiply that by 2. So that's 600 people. So if you have 300, 400 people show up for worship in a week, and we have 600 views or 300 views online, that's 600 people. So our worship attendance is 1,000 people per week. All right, so that's, by the way, our worship attendance is better than it's probably ever been, according to the numbers. But it's harder when it's online. Who are these people? I mean, we are in contact with some. Some are our people, some are associates, some are people that check in with us, send us nice cards. I'm not belittling any of this. But we still do not know as churches, is watching online things all by oneself, or as a couple people, does that actually form people? Does it shape people? There is something about coming together, having a worship service, sitting down, having coffee, visiting with your neighbor. There's something formative about that kind of shapes us, makes us who we are. We don't know yet if this is effective or not. So again, I want to say worship still has to be one of those landmarks that we use. The second thing that we have to do that I think looking forward is our church has to continue doing experiments. What I mean by that is at the end of this next year, I think one of the ways we say we're successful or not, this is going to sound so crazy. I should have thought of a better way to say this. We should be able to say if we had a successful year, we should be able to point to things that absolutely failed. Does that make sense to anybody? Meaning that we've tried some different things. So for instance, and hopefully we tried different things and maybe they all work, although that seems highly unlikely, doesn't it? But we did some things last year, like Worship Everywhere. Brian and Lisa were in charge of that. And I recognize some of you probably participated and some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. On Saturday mornings, we would just have a worship service that was announced. Brian, when would it would be announced? The location, where would it be announced? Where or when? When would you announce the location?
Try a few days ahead, maybe a week ahead.
Okay.
It was not quite that far in advance.
So a week from now, we're going to have a worship service at this point. And it was oftentimes a place people had to, hike to, travel to. People showed up for that. That was an incredibly meaningful type of experience. Now, if you would have told us, another thing we did, because it's very recent, Christmas Eve, the day before Christmas Eve, we decided we should have an outdoor option. Now, if you would have told me as a pastor 10 years ago, hey, the day before Christmas Eve, you're going to come up with a different option and you're going to put it out online and you're going to have, 50, 60 people show up for it and it will be well received, I would have said, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? It's doing those types of things. There's a little church in Mineola. Pastor Hannah is there. They started during COVID, they started a traveling food ministry. And what's funny about it is it's all farmers. They travel and they bring food to different people in their congregation and now into their community. All right, they gather food, they take it to people. But here's the funny thing: I came from an agricultural area. If you grew up on a farm, odds are you've got a pretty full pantry, right? These are people. Hannah laughs about this. Like she said, this is still the generation of people. They go to the store once a month. And when they come home, they're just, everything is full. she said, none of the people we're bringing food to actually need the food. But you know what they need? They need the visit. And so this is a rotation. So a lot of the people who are receiving the food are the same people who are gathering the food and delivering the food, okay? And so, but on one hand, it's on paper, it makes no sense whatsoever. But what is it doing? It's forming relationships. It's helping people, neighbors oftentimes, who've lived, a mile apart from one another, but for whatever reason haven't connected, are helping them to connect or reconnect. It's doing things like that. There's a billion different ideas, right? But that's one thing. Those holy experiments are vital. The third thing we need, and I'll go back to number one. I said worship is important, but please remember this. If the average person grows up in a world who knows less about the Christian faith than perhaps they did a generation ago. When I was a kid, whether you went to a church or not, you knew something about Christianity because it was just in the culture. Today, that is not the case. So if you have a young person or even a young adult who comes to church who knows nothing about Christianity and they show up once a month for a 45-minute service, that means over the course of one entire year, we get them 12 times for 45 minutes. How in depth is that experience likely going to be? It's not much, is it? Right? It's like saying I'm going to go to the gym one time a month and work out and ride the exercise bike for 45 minutes, and at the end of the year, I don't understand why my body doesn't look any different than it did a year ago. Right? It's just not enough. So we have to figure out other ways to help educate people. And so what I wrote down at number 3 is spaces for holy conversations. That Lenten series that Brian mentioned today, that we're going to do, offering a video series where people can do it at home. Ideally, they would do it with other friends, whether those are groups that we put together as a church, or if just like 7 or 8 different people say, hey, let's get together. Let's get together on Saturday mornings. We'll watch this video series, or maybe we'll get together and we'll have all watched it, and then we'll talk about the questions, and we'll meet down at Mandy's. Giving people an opportunity to talk about their faith is so critically important. Because, and this is also, I prefer when I go to an educational event, I like something that is an educational model that is based on what I grew up with, and that is I like a really smart person to go to the microphone and talk the entire time. And I like to sit and take notes and not talk to anybody else. That's what I prefer to do. Guess what? I'm an exception. That's not how most people learn. Most people want to throw questions back and forth. They want to talk. They want to meet in small groups, right? I don't like that. Pastors' conferences, it drives me crazy because that's always what we do. No, I want to hear the expert, but that's how most people learn and grow. So as a church, we have to figure out how to offer those opportunities to people. So it's not about just coming to church on a Sunday morning and listening to one of the preachers, share a message. It's actually getting them in a different place to say, hey, what does this look like in your life? Let's talk about the 10 Commandments and how does this play out in your life, and a lesson on the 10 Commandments, or a lesson on what does it feel to be lost. When have you felt lost in life? Does that make sense? Creating spaces for holy conversation. Okay. Fourth thing I would say is mission. Of all the churches that are doing well, almost all of their people, not all of their people, that'd be a gross over-exaggeration. Most of their leaders can point to mission that their congregation does, right? Can say, this is what we do. So our church is not known as, oh, come to our worship because our worship service is really good for whatever, blah, blah, blah. Most churches that are doing well can say, this is what our church is doing in the world. That resonates with people. Don't tell me about how Your pastor thinks he's funny, but he's really not. I don't want to hear about that if you're an unchurched. Tell me about how your church is feeding the homeless people, because that matters to me. Does that make sense? So and here's the good thing, we as a congregation, we are very generous. We do lots of things, both in the community and beyond. One of the things that I have talked about for about 18 months now, I think maybe 2 years, is to say, I think we are ripe for a big mission project as a congregation, to do something at a local level that would be significant, that would stretch us a little bit, okay? What form that could take could vary. Now here's where it is broken down, and I have to own this, and I'm, to be quite honest, disappointed in myself. I have thus far not come up with that great vision of what that should be. I thought it would become more clear. When we've talked about it this year as a church council, we've had some good conversations, but what often will happen, and this is nobody's fault, is you have this idea, oh, we should talk about this. But as other things come up, it gets moved to the back of the line. So what the church council is going to do this next year is to say, the way we're going to keep that central to us as a church, we're just going to have a committee. And I know committee, that doesn't sound like, oh, that'll change the world. You're going to have a committee. But a committee who says, okay, this is our job. We're going to come up with that significant mission project in our community. We'll have council people and then others on it to say, what is this going to be? Here's how we enact this. So it's not something that's necessarily my brainchild that I'm thinking about 1 month, but then the next month when things get busy, I forget all about it and everything puts on hold. Does that make sense? Okay. The fifth thing, this is going a little faster than I thought. I wanted to have a little more conversation. We've embarked on something during COVID that I think we were forced to do this, and this is going forward going to be very, very helpful for us. Frankly, it's a more biblical model. Our congregational care participation is really, really strong right now. We have a long list of Stephen ministers, very, very important ministry. We have home communion visitors who go out and visit people in home. Dave Larson, our newest member of that group. And then we have friendly visitors who are matched up, who are in contact with individual people. Why I say this is so important is to be able to identify people in our church who say, this person has these gifts. How do we put them to work? How do we help them to engage? Because that's what the Christian faith is. If it's a sport, everybody gets to play. Like, you got to get on the court and play. So if your gift is visiting, great. If your gift is listening, okay, we got to find a role for you. In addition, why that's so important is the idea of 1 or 2 people bringing out communion from our staff to people who are in need. That's fine, but then you can cover like this many people. If you get 5, 6, 7, 15, 20 people who are willing to go out and take communion, then what does that look like? Well, we cover so many more people, and here's the truth. Those relationships become far more meaningful. One good story, Pastor Artie from across the street, he has a story of going to visit someone who was on their deathbed. He went in to pray with the person, he brought communion, and the person said, oh, Pastor Artie, thank you for coming, thank you for praying, but I don't need communion because my minister was already here. And some pastors would be offended by that, and Artie said, no, that's perfect. That's exactly what you want. Like, this person was very cared for by his minister, the person from the church. What I do, I'm the cherry on top, but it's the idea of getting as many people to care about each other as we possibly can. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, those are the 5 landmarks I'm throwing out there for us to work with in this next year. All right.